thanks very much. It's really nice to talk in a small group like this of people who know North Korea, so I don't have to start from the beginning. You know, you guys know as much as I do, if not more. So it's just a pleasure to get into the findings that, you know, are potentially interesting, and also to figure out what they mean. Because one of the problems with this book is I don't know what conclusions to draw from it, frankly. I mean, it's very hard to know what the implications of these findings are. You know, it's not straightforward. So I can say things, but what they mean is you know, what the implications are is not easy, not clear to me. So what I want to do is outline the book for you briefly and just focus on a few findings. There are two surveys here. One was done with Yeonok Chung, who's a South Korean researcher in China in 2004-2005, and the other was done in November 2008. And basically the structure of the book is to focus on two things. One is the status of the refugees in China, and the other is what we can learn from the refugees about what's going on in North Korea. And I'm going to focus primarily on the second task, and I'm going to divide that discussion into three issues: marketization, the question of criminalization of the economy, and some findings on political attitudes and behavior. The question of whether marketization is leading to any kind of change in the political system. And that's where I really want your help. I'm curious in what you say. Let me start by talking about using refugee surveys, because Byung-Yeon in particular is aware of the sort of limits of this. So one question is, in authoritarian systems, do the behavior and attitude of citizens really matter? You know, does it matter what they think? So you can go survey refugees, but so what? Because change is really dictated at the top, right? So I think that's one thing we have to talk about. And the other thing is the whole question of sampling. Because we know that refugees are different. They're different because they left the country. So we know that they're particularly disaffected, right? They're more disaffected than the average citizen because they're so disaffected they left. So that's one problem we have. And then the other question is whether even if you don't have that selection problem, so-called selection problem, whether the refugee samples are representative, because we all know that, you know, the samples of refugees tend to over-represent Hamgyong and the East Coast. You know, sometimes as many as 70% of the refugee surveys, they're representing Hamgyong, and Pyongyang and other parts of the country tend to be underrepresented. So let me just, here's my defense on these questions. The first is that you know, citizen behavior is a constraint on the regime. You know, that's basically what we argue, that even a government like North Korea can't completely ignore what's happening below. And the example I use in this is the currency reform. I tried to do a study of the currency reform and look at how it unfolded over time. And one thing that's very interesting is that the government was continually changing the conversion limits, you know, over time. So in other words, it was looking at what was happening in the market, and then it was changing the conversion limit, and then it was looking at what was happening in the market, it was changing the conversion limit. So now that's just one small example, but I think that the leadership can't completely ignore the effects of its actions. And so what happens in the market is something that the government has to take into account. And the other thing, and again, Byung-Yeon is a better econometrician than I am, but you know, there are ways to use simple techniques to control ex post for biases in the sample. I mean, we do have representatives, for example, from Pyongyang in these surveys. It's not like we have none. And so we can adjust and play with the sample to generate counterfactuals through, you know, simple statistical techniques. So I think that this work, I think it has some value, but I want you to know that I'm aware of the limits, okay? So let's get to some of the results. Talking first about the refugee experience, one of the questions is why people leave. And one thing we noticed in the Korea survey, which is several years later than the China survey, is a higher percent of respondents were citing political motives. I mean, it's still mostly economic conditions. You know, if you look here at the question, this was the exact same question on both of the two surveys. You know, economic conditions is still the largest. But we were surprised by this. And I don't want to over-interpret this because the Seoul sample includes people who are now living in Korea, right? So maybe their views of why they left have actually changed as a result of being in Korea. But we nonetheless think that this is something that's potentially interesting, that those that are, you know, that in that sample you saw higher share citing politics. You know, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these findings. I think everyone knows that these populations are very vulnerable. One of the things that surprised us was a very low share of the sample was employed. About 20% was employed, so 80% of the sample was, in the China sample, was unemployed, which means that they're basically being taken care of in various ways by the Korean Chinese community. We also found evidence of trafficking, which I think has been well documented. People were aware of trafficking. They were aware of the fact that it was a problem. But one of the things we found, we focused on in the book, is this sort of psychological distress of the refugees. And a number of South Korean researchers have also made this point, that the refugees are really suffering from conditions that are very much like you know, post-traumatic stress disorder. But one of the interesting econometric findings is that the determinants of that distress seem to have as much to do with what happened to them in North Korea as what was happening in China. So, for example, we found evidence that distress was higher among people who lost a relative during the famine, or who had been denied food, or felt they had been denied food. So these even though these refugees were living in very vulnerable circumstances, the determinants of their distress seem to have as much to do with what happened in North Korea as it did in China. So I think that's an interesting finding, that this, you know, the trauma of the famine is very deep seated. Another thing that's interesting, and again, I'm curious about the researchers here, what they think, but we were looking for the question of whether people were crossing back and forth across the border, and we didn't find as much evidence as we thought. About 20% reported that they were moving back and forth. About 80% said that they were not. 20% were repatriated, so they were caught by the Chinese and sent back. But we didn't find a lot of evidence among this community that they're moving back and forth. I mean, some were, but it was a smaller share than we thought. And finally, one of the most interesting findings on the refugee experiences, we asked them where they wanted to resettle. And about 70% said South Korea, but, you know, as you would expect. But about 25% said the U.S., which I thought was very surprising, because these are not people who have been to South Korea. This was the China survey, and nonetheless, some share of them wanted to go to the U.S., and we found that education was a significant determinant of favoring the U.S. over Korea. So those with higher education were more likely to want to go to the U.S. than to go to Korea, which, again, you know, kind of a surprising finding. But you know, again, maybe someone has an idea about an interpretation. Okay, so let me spend time on this slide, because I think it's one that most of you are aware of, but I like this slide, and Mark, my colleague, hates it, because it's a little complicated, but let me explain. So this is a minimum human need of about 457 grams of food per day. And then this line traces the average rations delivered by the public distribution system over time. And then these are the high rations delivered, that is the highest ration delivered during that period, and these are the lowest rations. But these are probably even high in some cases because, of course, during the famine, the PDS basically broke down. So the point here is that if you look over time, beginning in the famine, the public distribution system is obviously not distributing a minimum daily need of food, right? But notice that it never goes back up above that line. So even straight through this entire period, the public distribution system is never delivering enough food. So obviously, if this were the case, then there should be famine all throughout this period. And the reason there isn't is because people are purchasing food on the market. Notice that the government recognizes the importance of farmers having adequate rations. And so we see an increase after the famine in farmers' rations. So farmers' rations go up, but non-farm rations stay below this minimum. So this is just the evidence that this marketization is obviously an ongoing thing. So we asked, what we did was we divided the sample into people who left during the famine era, those who left after the famine, and those who left after the reform. So we could kind of tell, this is imperfect, but it's comparing different cohorts of people, right? And notice that in the famine era, you have about 61% of our respondents who said they're involved in private trading. And as you know, these August 3rd units, I don't need to tell this audience what those are about. But then what's interesting is after the famine, this even goes up. So again, this is not just, the marketization is not just a function of the famine era, it's even higher in the post-famine period. You know, so very high share of the sample that's involved in some kind of private trading activity. Now, whether that's, you know, just the sample, whether that's just refugees, we don't know. But we were just surprised by how high these numbers were, you know, the fact that so many were involved in the market. Now, here's a set of questions that we thought were particularly interesting. I'd like to get your views. So we asked people, what's the easiest way to make money in North Korea? And this little blue part is work hard at your assigned job. So basically, no one thinks that the way to get ahead in North Korea is to work at your assigned job, right? None of the refugees, anyway. Almost all of them say that, you know, you have to engage in market activities. But notice this, engage in corrupt or criminal activities actually goes up. So during the post-reform period, now come back to what this means, but we see evidence that people believe that the only way to get ahead is to engage in corrupt or criminal activities, okay? Now, then we ask a question that was phrased a little bit differently. What's the best way to get ahead in North Korea? What's the best way to get ahead? And what's interesting is, by far, the dominant response is to become a government or party official. So if you put those two together, you get a very interesting picture. Because people say that to get ahead, you become a government or party official, but to make money, you engage in market activities. And so clearly, these two things are connected, right? That you get ahead by becoming a government or party official, in part because it allows you to engage in this kind of activity, right? So, and this gets to the issue of what kind of economy is emerging in North Korea, and clearly corruption is playing a major role in the way that the market functions there. This is becoming an increasingly corrupt economy, we think. So again, here are some respondents. This is a question, this was people who left after the reforms of 2002. The majority here says that corruption increased after the reforms. Corruption increased. So we don't know what the level is, but it increased after the reform. A majority said they had to pay bribes, to engage in private activity, 80%. And this is fascinating to me. Society became more unequal following the reforms. So it's becoming more corrupt, there's more need to pay bribes to engage in the market, and it's becoming unequal, okay? Now, look at the responses to "I was better off." So this is a personal level question, not is North Korea better off or people better off. It's "I was better off" after the reforms. And what's interesting here is about half say that they were definitely worse off, right? But notice that about 22% say, well, they're either neutral or they were better off. So how we interpret this is some people are better off, but other people are not better off, which sort of fits with this idea that the society is becoming more unequal, that some people are managing to do better as a result of the reforms because of their ability to engage in the market effectively, and others are worse off because they can't, or they feel that their opportunities are stunted. Now, let me turn to another chapter of the book and talk about criminal activity. We studied the changes in the criminal code, drawing again on good South Korean research on this. There are these two changes in the criminal code in 2004 and 2007. And one of the things we find is that the number of economic crimes in the criminal code goes up dramatically. So the criminal code, as this marketization takes place, there are more and more crimes that are economic crimes. And some of them are quite obvious, like stealing state property and misusing state assets and so forth. But you really see large portions of the criminal code that are increasingly devoted to what we call economic crimes, which is basically a lot of it. Some of it's theft of state property, some of it's operating in the market. But one of the things we found, and Marcus is responsible for this, and he picked this up. But we found that there's a statistical relationship between being involved in the market and the likelihood of being arrested. So people who are in the market are being arrested for engaging in market activity. In fact, it's a 50% higher arrest rate of those who are involved in market activity. And so we started to try to think about what role the penal system was playing in the market and in the emergence of the market sector. And we found that there's been so much focus in the human rights community on the kwanliso, in the large prison camps. But what we focused on is the emergence of these labor training camps, these rodongdan ryondae. And we were surprised that most of the people who had been arrested in this sample were in these low-level labor camps, So then we started to look in what was their experience in these labor camps, because we thought of these as just labor camps. They're in the labor camps, they're doing work for the local authorities and so forth. But what we found is that the conditions in these labor camps were as bad as the conditions in the kwanliso. It's just that people are there for a shorter amount of time. So they go into the labor camp, they witness executions, they witness forced starvation, they witness death by torture. I mean, look, 60% of the people in these labor training centers witnessed an execution. 85%, 90% say they witnessed forced starvation, but you're only in there for a short amount of time. And so what we think is going on is we arrest you, we put you in this horrible place, and then you use this kind of terror in these camps to extract bribes. So the more horrible the prison system, the more easy it is to, to predate on economic activity that's going on. So, you know, I don't know if this is right, but there's a complex of issues that's going on that has to do with the market, corruption, the criminalization of economic activity, and the penal system that has to be understood as a kind of whole. And, you know, if we want to understand what's going on in the North Korean economy, we have to look at it through this kind of political economy lens. I mean, it's clear that bribery and the threat of being incarcerated is ever present in North Korea. Okay, I might talk for a few more minutes than I said I would. Let me just say something about political behavior and political attitudes. So, you know, not surprisingly, you know, the views of the refugees towards the regime are overwhelmingly negative, which is not surprising. They left, right? So there's no surprise there. But we do see some interesting things that, you know, that validate, you know, what Andrei Lankoff and others are finding. So we find that that increasing access to the foreign media, that is, the people who say they have access to news, they're listening to news and so forth, have more negative views of the regime than those who don't. Okay? So in other words, you know, the conservatives here think we should be broadcasting and so forth. But, you know, there's some evidence that it has an effect. You know, that those who hear foreign news have more negative views of the regime, more dissenting views, you know. And by the way, notice that we divided the sample into these four parts, you know, that left during the famine, post-famine, reform, retrenchment. And notice that there is an increase in those that said they watched or listened to foreign news. And there's a decline in the number that said they had access to it, but they didn't listen. Okay. So, so that's one interesting bit of information. Now, again, remember that these are refugees, so all the caveats hold. But we ask people the reason why the North Korean economy was getting worse, and if you look in the famine period, about 20% said that the policies of foreign governments were responsible for North Korea's problems. So about 20% said, you know, the foreigners are responsible. 80% of the refugees said the policies of the North Korean government. And again, this isn't surprising because the refugees are hostile towards the regime, right? But what's interesting is the share of people who say that the policies of foreign governments are responsible is declining. So even though it's small, it's declining. You know, more of the refugees are saying, look, this is the responsibility of the Kim Jong-il regime. So, you know, something is going on here over time, it seems to us. While it may be harder for the regime ideologically to convince people that the difficulties are a result of foreigners. And I think this is one of the reasons why we have so much speculation about the events of next year. You know, the importance of gifts, the importance of having rice, the importance of showing that the regime is capable of delivering food and goods to the population, okay? But when we ask people about political behavior, we still see that this is very atomized, you know? Like this is the share of people who say that people make jokes about the government. And notice that, you know, 40%, 50% say no, they don't. You know, they disagree. People don't even make jokes about the government. And the share that says that they don't make jokes even goes up during this post-2005 period. And if you ask about organizing or other kinds of overt political behavior, there's no evidence in this sample that people are organizing or doing anything like that. So it's really still very risky to engage in even minimal political activity, like making jokes about the government. Okay? Let me move on here. I'm going to skip some of this and just talk very briefly. We have a discussion. I want to hear what you guys have to say about policy, but we have a kind of matrix of types of policies towards North Korea. And, you know, we note that the human rights, if you think about a human rights policy for North Korea, there are really 4 types of policies. You can have policies towards the resident population and policies towards the refugees. And then you can have direct policies, which is to try to encourage the North Koreans to do something about these things. And then you can have indirect policies, which don't involve negotiations with the North Koreans. And this would be things like a North Korean Human Rights Act, or supporting asylum, or refugee scholarships, or easing repatriation. So this is just a kind of typology of policies. But let me just say something about the whole issue of engagement. You know, because Mark and I still, you know, spend a lot of time thinking about how do you engage North Korea? Is there any way to, you know, engage them effectively? And I think that, you know, we all agree that the ideal combination would be policies that addressed the material deprivation of the North Koreans, but also encouraged systemic transformation, right? That's what everyone wants to do, and it's extremely hard to do. So let me just talk about some of the things that are going on, and let me start with the food issue, because Mark and I are both very pessimistic about the current food situation in North Korea. And I'm always surprised when I'm here in South Korea, because I hear this one thing, it drives me crazy, I confess, is things aren't that bad in North Korea. Things aren't that bad right now. And then they say, they're not that bad compared to the famine. Well, 600,000 people died during the famine. Of course they're not that bad. But the question is there hunger in North Korea now, and is there malnutrition? And I think the answer is certainly yes. And we think it's probably worse than 2008. But let me explain why we think that, okay? So the UN system has a problem, because the UN system, so this is the what we call the food surplus deficit, or surplus, okay? So this is an effort to take total minimum human need and total production, imports, and aid, and calculate the difference, okay? So basically, if this is above 0, it means that there's at least enough food in principle to feed everyone. It may be badly distributed, but there's enough food to feed everyone at some minimum requirement. And if it's below this, then there's not enough food to feed everyone, okay? Now, if you look at the UN estimates, they're always below, you know, this line, right? And so we just think that the UN estimates are wrong. I mean, because if you had this estimates like this every single year, there'd be famine in 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, and again from 2006 there'd be famine. I mean, there'd be not enough food to feed everyone, right? So we've made 2 adjustments in this. One is, instead of using North Korean data on food production, we've used a combination of US and South Korean data on total production. And the other thing we've done is, we think that the UN overestimates the role of staple grains in the diet. And so we've lowered the amount of total grain you need to feed the whole population, because people have other sources of calories. You know, they're eating vegetables, there's some meat, you know, they're getting other calories. And even when we do that, you see, okay, so this is the famine, this is Haggard and Nolan, so we agree that there's definitely a shortage there, but then, you know, the situation's okay, and then this is 2008, 2007-8. Right, which we know was bad because of the floods. And now look at 2009, 10, 2011. You know, it seems to us they're back. And the UN is saying that it's way down here, but even with our adjustments, we think the aggregate food picture is bad, you know. So Why is it that people think that the situation is okay? You know, because you read daily NK, you know, people seem to be doing okay, they seem to be doing okay. The reason they think it's okay is because more and more people are buying their food in the market, and so there's access to food through the market. But guys, look at these prices, okay? These are prices, just nominal prices, since the currency conversion, okay? And you just see this incredible volatility in prices. But, you know, look at the trend, right? And so what we think is happening is that people who can afford food are doing fine. But the hunger is either in institutions where the PDS is collapsed, or with people who are dependent on the market for food but can't afford it. Because remember, one of the most important findings of Amartya Sen's work is that people can die from hunger if there's food but they can't afford it, okay? Because they don't have adequate income. And if you look at these prices, you know, it's clear that there are people who are not, you know, are facing these very high and volatile prices for food. So we think that, you know, we can debate this. I'm really curious about your views, but we think that that the situation is serious, and there should probably be some assistance provided. Okay. I want to stop because I think I've said most of what I want to say. But let me just say that one last thing is we just have to, you know, any engagement that we do, you know, if we're providing some assistance, we just always have to try to improve the programmatic quality. I can talk about the politics of this in the United States. Monitoring is the key issue in getting food, and right now I don't see a decision coming immediately from the U.S. The U.S. is not likely to move. We always have to raise the issue of agricultural reforms. We can't just give food and say this is just food. We have to talk about agriculture to the extent we can. I believe we should make the offer to get them into the international financial institutions. I don't see why we should wait. They should be in the Asian Development Bank probably first. But the real trick, you know, is how to focus on commercial engagement, you know, is moving away from aid towards types of engagement in which the North Koreans are not politicizing the transactions, you know. And if anyone has any good ideas, I'm willing to listen. But you know, there's too much focus on aid, and there's too much focus on politicized commercial transactions. And I think if we can get out of the current hole, that the direction of South Korean policy should be, we're ready to do business, but you have to make it profitable for our firms, and we are not, the South Korean government, we are not going to bail them out. You know, we're not going to bail out Kumgang, we're not going to bail out Kaesong, we're not going to guarantee these transactions. You know, if you want to have a kind of engagement with us, then it has to be profitable for South Korean companies, because otherwise you just have moral hazard, you know, which is that the North Korean government will use Kaesong and manipulate Kaesong to get South Korean firms protected, you know, and that's a losing proposition, I think, for everyone. So why don't I stop here and listen to what you have to say.